Austen, I want to get your take on some of the comments we're reading here this morning from Cardinal Sarah, the African cardinal who works in the Vatican Congregation for Worship. He's saying that there's an agenda, a pro-Western homosexual and abortion agenda that's coming up, and he's likening it to communism and fascism. Is that typical of what we're hearing from the Synod floor?
No, it's pretty typical of what I think some prelates, some synod fathers are talking about. I think it's a minority. I think it's probably there are about 15 or 20, I would say, synod fathers. Remember, we've got about 270 voting members of the synod, so this is a minority, but nonetheless fairly high-ranking prelates like Cardinal Sarah, who I think are just taking a view really that they're distrustful, I think, of the whole synod process, and they're distrustful of any attempt to loosen, as they would see it, or dilute, as they would see it, the church's witness, because they have a basically beleaguered view. Now, in part, he's echoing the views of the African prelates, and there is a very, very strong undercurrent of resistance among the African prelates to what they call ideological colonization, which is a phrase, of course, that Pope Francis has himself used. And they see anything to do with homosexuality, promiscuity, as all kind of Western imports into Africa which need to be resisted.
Well, Cardinal Nichols from Great Britain also had an intervention, and he's saying that we need a more theological basis. We need to hear what a church definition of marriage is. And he said that the public, that the members of the church need to hear this from the bishops, and he's not sure that's coming through right now. What do you think about that?
Well, Cardinal Nichols spoke to the press yesterday, and in fact gave a very, very good briefing. He's like all the synod prelates, at least, who have come out and spoken to the journalists, is very, very. He has a very high opinion of this synod. Thinks it's a very dynamic, creative, and free synod. There's, the reason I want to point this out is that there's a lot of stuff out there which is painting the synod as either chaotic or divided, and neither is true. It's a serene gathering. There's a lot of very, very deep debate going on. Of course, there's vigorous disagreement, but that's not a bad thing. But there's no parties. Cardinal Scola of Milan was saying only yesterday on television that this is not a synod that's divided between two parties. There are obviously different trends and different priorities. Cardinal Nichols, I think, is talking about the particular the theological development that there's been in this synod about the relationship between justice and mercy, which is a major theme of this synod. Now, he pointed us yesterday, interestingly, to the small group reports by the German synod fathers. Now, there's only one German language group. They've got a small language group, a small group, and they've done a report, a very interesting, quite theologically deep stuff about this relationship between justice and mercy. And what Cardinal Nichols was saying to us is actually is look at who's in that group and take note of the fact that they've agreed this. So, there's a kind of a news story that hasn't quite broken yet, which is the Germans agree theologically on the relationship between justice and mercy. Now, the reason that this is important is that there have been quite a few very public battles between very high-profile German cardinals, not namely, obviously, Cardinal Kasper, the main proponent of a new approach to, or a more open approach to the issue of sacraments for the divorced and remarried. Cardinal Müller, the head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith, being one, of course, his leading opponents of that. So the fact they've sort of reached this agreement, I think, shows that there is something quite deep going on here in the synod. But I think the lurid stuff, Cardinal Sarah, there is some very lurid language being used but I think that's really they're very much noises off, and I think most of the synod actually is using actually a very serene language. They're listening to each other, and there is a call for, and I think this is definitely, as I mentioned in my article, for the tablet, one of the results of this synod is a call for a new kind of language, for the church to update its language to be used about the family, and even a call which Cardinal Nichols made, we need a better definition and understanding, actually, of marriage and family than the one that we're working with.
There's a lay couple that was quoted in the Catholic News Service this week, and they're taking part in some of the small group discussions, which I know you're not privy to, but they're saying that what's being reported in the press is not really reflected in what's being said in these small group discussions. Do you hear that?
Well, that's actually not just what the auditors, as they're called, the invited participants. It's really what actually all the synod fathers who come out to brief the journalists are saying to us. In other words, the story out there is not what's going on inside. The same thing happened, Ed, last year with the synod. And I think it's partly, the fact that it is actually quite hard for journalists to understand what's going on. After all, you've got a conversation here between, a very sophisticated discussion, mostly sophisticated anyway, going on between, 270 leaders of the church from across the world. And of course, it is very hard to get a grip on what's really kind of going on. So inevitably, we outside the media tends to concentrate on splits and divisions and the more kind of lurid or intransigent stuff which gets out. But I don't think that's representative. I think there's a lot of what the Pope called for, which is listening.
In our final minute, you wrote in the tablet this week, you posed the question, what's the story here at the Synod, that you're having a difficult time trying to find the storyline? Are you any closer today to seeing what is the story from coming out of this Synod?
Well, very interestingly, today we had a briefing on the interventions, the speeches, which are now in their third week. Even though it's the second week of the Synod, they've actually moved on to the third part of the document, which is coming up with actual pastoral solutions. And of course, they've dug deep now into this vexed question of sacraments for the divorced and remarried. And there have been a lot of contributions. It's been a very, very rich debate, as I understand it. I sense that there's going to be movement on this, and that I think the story is increasingly that doctrine will not change, but they are going to come up with some of the creative thinking and solutions which the Pope has called for. But Ed, one thing to just point out, as has been pointed out to us today, this Synod will decide nothing. It is not a deliberative Synod. It will give the fruit of its reflection to the Holy Father, who will then take that, and we don't know what he will do with it. He could choose to publish it, or he could choose to respond to it in a teaching document of his own, as Cardinal Nichols was saying yesterday. What's needed now is for the Pope to land this thing.
Right.
He's got to take all this and really run with it, and only he can do that.
All right, Austen, thanks again for your insights. We'll be checking back with you during the last week of the Synod. We'll talk to you again.
Nice to be with you, Ed.